In the United States, the idea of freedom has always carried a powerful promise, the belief that citizens can speak, organize, and dissent without fear of being watched. But beneath that promise, there was a period when surveillance quietly became policy, and suspicion replaced trust. For decades, a hidden program operated not on distant battlefields, but within American cities, universities, churches, and living rooms. It did not announce itself with uniforms or public orders. Instead, it worked through files, informants, and silent observation, carefully collecting information on citizens whose only offense was speaking too loudly, organizing too effectively, or questioning authority too openly. Most Americans never knew it existed. Those who were monitored rarely understood why their lives felt disrupted, jobs lost, reputations damaged, movements fractured from within. There were no public trials, no formal accusations, and often no clear explanation. Just pressure. Just fear. Just silence. This was not a foreign intelligence operation. It was domestic. It targeted Americans. And it operated under the belief that certain ideas themselves were dangerous. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was designed to protect national security. But in practice, it raised a far more unsettling question: when the government decides to monitor its own citizens, who decides where safety ends and freedom begins? Tonight's story is not about espionage abroad. It is about surveillance at home, and the fragile boundary between protection and control. To understand COINTELPRO, it is necessary to step back into the political and social climate of mid-20th century America, a nation defined by both confidence and fear. The United States had emerged from World War II as a global power, but that power came with anxiety. The Cold War introduced a persistent sense of threat, not only from foreign governments, but from ideas perceived as subversive. Communism, civil unrest, and social change became framed as dangers to national stability. Government institutions, tasked with protecting the country, increasingly viewed dissent not as a democratic function, but as a vulnerability. In this atmosphere, loyalty was measured, suspicion was normalized, and surveillance became justified as prevention. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the long leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, played a central role in shaping this mindset. Hoover believed deeply that internal enemies posed an existential risk to the nation. His views were reinforced by decades of political pressure, public fear, and a growing belief that unconventional methods were necessary to maintain order. At the same time, American society was undergoing rapid transformation. The civil rights movement challenged racial inequality. Anti-war protests questioned foreign policy. Student organizations demanded institutional reform. Religious groups, labor unions, and political activists increasingly exercised their constitutional rights to assemble and speak freely. These movements were diverse in ideology and purpose, but they shared a common trait: visibility. They organized publicly, attracted attention, and often disrupted established norms. For institutions focused on stability, this visibility became synonymous with threat. Rather than responding through open debate or legal reform, segments of the government turned inward, developing systems to quietly observe, influence, and disrupt these groups. Surveillance was no longer limited to individuals suspected of crimes. It extended to organizations, leaders, and sometimes entire communities. Importantly, much of this activity occurred outside public awareness. Oversight was minimal, and justification was often internal. The prevailing logic held that secrecy itself was necessary for security. As a result, actions taken in the name of protection rarely faced external scrutiny. COINTELPRO emerged within this environment, not as a single decision, but as an accumulation of assumptions. It was shaped by fear of infiltration, distrust of activism, and a belief that preventing unrest justified extraordinary measures. This context matters because COINTELPRO was not an isolated anomaly. It reflected broader tensions within American democracy, between safety and liberty, order and dissent, authority and accountability. Understanding those tensions is essential to understanding how a program designed to defend democracy came to challenge its very foundations. COINTELPRO did not begin with a public announcement or a defining moment that captured national attention. Instead, it emerged quietly, built from internal memoranda, policy discussions, and an evolving belief within federal law enforcement that traditional investigative methods were no longer sufficient. The program officially began in 1956, initially focused on monitoring organizations associated with communist ideology. At the time, this focus appeared consistent with prevailing Cold War priorities. The fear of foreign influence shaped nearly every aspect of national security planning, and intelligence agencies were encouraged to act decisively, even preemptively. What made COINTELPRO distinct was not its interest in political groups, but its approach. The program was designed not merely to observe, but to interfere. Internal documents described objectives such as disrupting leadership structures, discrediting individuals, and weakening organizations from within. These goals marked a departure from passive intelligence gathering toward active manipulation. The FBI justified these measures through a framework of prevention. Officials argued that waiting for illegal activity posed too great a risk. Instead, they believed that influencing behavior before it escalated was a necessary safeguard. This reasoning allowed the program to operate in areas where no crimes had occurred, and where constitutional protections were most relevant. As years passed, the scope of COINTELPRO expanded. Civil rights organizations, student movements, anti-war groups, and various political activists were added to surveillance lists. The criteria for inclusion were often broad, sometimes vague, and rarely transparent. Advocacy itself became grounds for attention. The structure of the program ensured secrecy. Activities were compartmentalized, oversight was limited, and documentation was often classified. Decisions were concentrated among senior officials, reducing external accountability. Even within the agency, awareness of the program's full extent was restricted. Importantly, COINTELPRO relied heavily on indirect methods. Anonymous letters, planted rumors, and strategic leaks were used to create internal conflict within organizations. The intent was subtle disruption, actions that could not easily be traced back to federal authority. This early phase established patterns that would define the program for years. Surveillance became routine. Intervention became normalized. And the line between national security and political control grew increasingly blurred. At its core, COINTELPRO reflected a shift in how dissent was perceived. Rather than viewing activism as an expression of democratic engagement, it was increasingly treated as a destabilizing force requiring management. The beginning of COINTELPRO was not marked by public controversy. It unfolded in silence, driven by internal conviction rather than public mandate. And it was this quiet origin, unchecked and unseen, that allowed the program to grow far beyond its initial justification. As COINTELPRO expanded, what sustained it was not only institutional intent, but silence. Silence from oversight bodies, silence from the courts, and silence from the public, largely because the public did not know what was happening. This silence became a form of permission, allowing the program to evolve without meaningful resistance. Within the federal system, COINTELPRO existed in a space where accountability was fragmented. Congressional oversight of intelligence activities during this period was minimal and often informal. Many lawmakers deferred to security agencies, trusting that their actions were necessary and lawful. This deference created an environment where questions were rarely asked, and answers were seldom demanded. The judiciary, too, played a limited role. Because COINTELPRO activities were designed to avoid direct legal confrontation, they rarely appeared in court. There were no warrants to challenge, no defendants to defend themselves, and no formal charges to scrutinize. The absence of visible legal conflict reinforced the illusion that nothing improper was occurring. Inside the FBI, institutional culture further discouraged dissent. Loyalty to leadership was emphasized, and internal criticism was often viewed as disloyalty. The program's secrecy ensured that even agents who felt uneasy about certain practices lacked the full picture needed to object effectively. Compartmentalization insulated decision-makers from consequences. Ethical boundaries blurred gradually rather than abruptly. Actions that might once have seemed questionable became routine through repetition. Anonymous letters sent to undermine trust. Informants encouraged to intensify internal disputes. Surveillance reports used not to prevent crime, but to influence reputations and relationships. Each action, taken alone, appeared minor. Together, they formed a system of quiet coercion. This normalization of intrusion reflected a deeper systemic failure, the belief that outcomes justified methods. Protecting stability became more important than protecting rights. In this framework, constitutional safeguards were treated as obstacles rather than foundations. The individuals targeted by COINTELPRO often experienced consequences without explanation. Organizations fractured under unexplained pressure. Leaders found themselves isolated. Careers stalled. Social networks eroded. Yet because these effects were indirect, victims struggled to identify their source, much less challenge them. Media silence also played a role. Without access to classified information, journalists lacked evidence to investigate. Occasional rumors of surveillance surfaced, but they were easily dismissed as paranoia or exaggeration. The absence of confirmation preserved official credibility. Systemic failure is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with crisis or collapse. Instead, it emerges through neglect, when mechanisms designed to protect accountability remain unused. COINTELPRO thrived in precisely such conditions. What makes this period particularly significant is how ordinary the process appeared to those inside it. Meetings were routine. Reports were filed. Procedures were followed. The machinery of governance functioned smoothly, even as it drifted away from democratic principles. Silence, in this context, was not passive. It was active reinforcement. Each unasked question, each unexamined report, strengthened the system's momentum. By the time doubts surfaced more widely, COINTELPRO had already become deeply embedded. This section of the story reveals that the greatest vulnerability in democratic systems is not overt abuse, but unchecked authority operating beyond visibility. COINTELPRO did not require mass approval. It required only the absence of scrutiny. The effects of COINTELPRO did not end when files were closed or operations concluded. Its most enduring impact unfolded quietly, shaping lives, movements, and public trust long after the program itself receded from view. This long shadow extended beyond individual targets, influencing the broader relationship between citizens and the state. For many organizations subjected to surveillance and disruption, recovery was slow and incomplete. Internal divisions, often intensified by anonymous interference, left lasting scars. Trust eroded, leadership weakened, and collective momentum diminished. Even when external pressure subsided, uncertainty remained, altering how people organized and communicated. On an individual level, the consequences were deeply personal. Careers were disrupted without explanation. Reputations suffered subtle damage. Social circles narrowed as suspicion replaced openness. The absence of transparency meant that many affected individuals never fully understood why opportunities disappeared or relationships fractured. Beyond these immediate impacts, COINTELPRO reshaped behavior. Activists and organizers became more cautious, sometimes avoiding lawful expression out of fear of attention. This phenomenon, often described as a chilling effect, discouraged participation not through force, but through uncertainty. When people believe they are being watched, they often limit themselves. The program also altered institutional norms. Surveillance practices introduced during this period influenced future approaches to intelligence and law enforcement. Methods once considered exceptional gradually became acceptable under certain conditions. The boundary between investigation and interference remained blurred, even after COINTELPRO officially ended. Public trust suffered as well, though largely in retrospect. Once details emerged, many Americans re-evaluated assumptions about government transparency and accountability. Confidence in institutions depends not only on outcomes, but on adherence to principles. COINTELPRO challenged that confidence by revealing how easily secrecy could override safeguards. Generational memory played a role in sustaining this impact. Stories of surveillance and disruption were passed down within families and communities, shaping attitudes toward authority. These narratives influenced how later movements approached organization, communication, and engagement with institutions. Importantly, the long shadow of COINTELPRO extends into legal and cultural debates about privacy and oversight. Questions raised by the program about surveillance limits, consent, and accountability remain relevant as technology evolves. Modern discussions about data collection and monitoring often echo concerns first articulated in response to COINTELPRO. The program's legacy is not defined solely by what it did, but by what it changed. It altered expectations, behaviors, and trust. It demonstrated how fear-driven policy can produce lasting consequences that outlive the perceived threat. Understanding this long shadow is essential because it highlights the enduring cost of secrecy without accountability. COINTELPRO did not end with its termination. Its influence persists in how Americans think about surveillance, dissent, and the balance between security and freedom. For nearly 2 decades, COINTELPRO operated in near-total secrecy. Its exposure did not come through official disclosure or internal reform, but through an unexpected breach, one that forced hidden practices into public view. In 1971, a group of private citizens broke into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. Their objective was not theft for profit, but information. Inside, they found documents that revealed the existence of a covert program targeting domestic political organizations. These documents were anonymously mailed to journalists and members of Congress. What followed was a moment of national reckoning. For the first time, the public saw evidence that federal authorities had actively monitored and disrupted lawful political activity. The language in the documents was clinical, procedural, and unsettling. It confirmed long-held suspicions that surveillance extended far beyond criminal investigation. Media outlets began publishing detailed reports. Headlines questioned the scope of government authority. Editorials debated whether national security concerns justified interference in democratic participation. For many Americans, the revelations were difficult to reconcile with their understanding of constitutional protections. Public reaction was mixed but intense. Some defended the program as a necessary response to perceived threats during a turbulent era. Others viewed it as a fundamental betrayal of civil liberties. The divide reflected broader tensions within society, between fear and freedom, order and rights. Congress responded with increased scrutiny. Investigative committees were formed to examine intelligence practices across multiple agencies. Testimony revealed the breadth of COINTELPRO's reach and the lack of oversight that had allowed it to persist. Lawmakers expressed concern not only about specific actions, but about systemic failures that made them possible. For those who had been targeted, exposure brought both validation and frustration. While public acknowledgement confirmed their experiences, accountability remained limited. Few individuals faced direct consequences, and many questions about responsibility went unanswered. The FBI officially terminated COINTELPRO following the revelations, but the damage to public trust was already done. Confidence in government transparency suffered, and skepticism toward intelligence operations increased. Importantly, exposure shifted the national conversation. Surveillance was no longer an abstract concern. It became a tangible issue tied to real people and real consequences. The public began demanding clearer limits, stronger oversight, and greater transparency. This moment marked a turning point, not because it resolved the issues raised by COINTELPRO, but because it made them impossible to ignore. The exposure forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about power exercised in secrecy. The reaction to COINTELPRO demonstrated that democratic accountability often depends on visibility. Without it, even well-established institutions can drift beyond their intended boundaries. The program's exposure reminded the nation that transparency is not automatic, it must be actively defended. In the wake of COINTELPRO's exposure, the United States faced a critical question: how could a democratic system prevent such practices from re-emerging? The answer did not arrive quickly, nor did it come from a single reform. Instead, change unfolded through a series of institutional responses shaped by public pressure and political necessity. Congressional investigations became the first step. Committees tasked with examining intelligence activities documented extensive abuses of authority across multiple agencies. Their findings confirmed that COINTELPRO was not an isolated deviation, but part of a broader pattern of unchecked power enabled by secrecy and weak oversight. As a result, new frameworks for accountability began to take shape. Intelligence agencies were required to establish clearer internal guidelines. Reporting requirements increased. Oversight committees gained more formal authority, signaling a shift toward institutional transparency, even if imperfect. The judiciary also played a role in reinforcing constitutional protections. Court rulings emphasized the importance of warrants, due process, and limitations on surveillance. While these decisions did not erase past actions, they helped define legal boundaries moving forward. Within federal agencies, cultural change proved slower. Institutional habits formed over decades could not be undone overnight. However, the exposure of COINTELPRO altered internal risk calculations. Leaders became more aware that secrecy carried consequences, and that public trust was a fragile asset. Public discourse evolved as well. Surveillance, once discussed primarily in terms of national security, increasingly included civil liberties. Advocacy organizations expanded efforts to educate citizens about privacy rights. Media scrutiny of intelligence practices intensified, reinforcing external accountability. For individuals affected by COINTELPRO, the aftermath was complex. Some received formal acknowledgement or symbolic redress, while others saw little resolution. The uneven nature of accountability underscored the difficulty of addressing systemic harm after the fact. Importantly, the reforms that followed COINTELPRO were preventive rather than corrective. They aimed to limit future abuses rather than fully address past ones. This distinction reflected a broader challenge within democratic systems, correcting structural flaws without destabilizing institutions. The legacy of these changes remains visible today. Oversight mechanisms introduced in response to COINTELPRO continue to influence intelligence governance. They serve as reminders that authority must be balanced by restraint, and that trust depends on accountability. Yet reform is not static. The aftermath of COINTELPRO demonstrated that safeguards require constant reinforcement. As technology evolves and new threats emerge, the temptation to expand surveillance persists. The lessons of the past remain relevant precisely because the conditions that enabled abuse can reappear. Ultimately, the changes prompted by COINTELPRO did not resolve every concern, but they established an essential precedent, that secrecy without oversight is incompatible with democratic values. This recognition stands as one of the most significant outcomes of the program's exposure. COINTELPRO is not merely a historical case study, it serves as a lens through which we can examine the ongoing tension between security and freedom in contemporary America. Though the program ended decades ago, its lessons remain deeply relevant, reminding us of the fragility of civil liberties in the face of secrecy. Modern surveillance practices are far more technologically sophisticated, yet the core ethical dilemmas persist. How much monitoring is justified in the name of national security? Who decides which individuals or groups merit scrutiny? The questions posed by COINTELPRO echo in debates about digital privacy, data collection, and governmental oversight in the 21st century. One of the most important reflections is on the balance between transparency and security. COINTELPRO thrived in an environment where secrecy was normalized and accountability minimized. Today, even when intelligence programs are legally justified, transparency and independent oversight are essential to prevent abuses and maintain public trust. Society has learned that ignoring these principles can produce long-term consequences, both for targeted individuals and for the collective social fabric. The program also offers insight into the relationship between activism and authority. Organizations that exercise their right to dissent can be perceived as threats, even when operating legally and ethically. COINTELPRO demonstrates the dangers of equating dissent with disloyalty, showing how fear-driven policies can undermine democracy itself. These lessons are particularly relevant in times of political polarization, when public institutions must navigate the fine line between order and freedom. Another reflection concerns the psychological and social effects of surveillance. Fear, uncertainty, and the erosion of trust can linger long after the program has ended. Communities affected by COINTELPRO internalized these pressures, which altered organizational structures, communication strategies, and civic engagement. Recognizing this, contemporary society can better safeguard against the subtle ways in which monitoring and intimidation can inhibit legitimate participation. Moreover, COINTELPRO encourages ongoing dialogue about ethics and governance. Decisions taken in secret can have profound consequences for ordinary citizens. A democratic system requires vigilance, not only from institutions, but from an engaged public capable of questioning authority, demanding accountability, and advocating for civil rights. Finally, reflecting on COINTELPRO offers a broader understanding of history as a teacher. The program is a reminder that policies developed with seemingly reasonable intentions can produce unintended consequences when unchecked. Learning from these experiences helps modern societies prevent repetition, ensuring that liberty is not compromised for the sake of expediency. By connecting past and present, COINTELPRO illustrates that surveillance is not merely a technical or procedural matter, it is a moral and civic issue. Its modern relevance extends beyond policy, serving as a cautionary tale about the continuous responsibility required to protect democratic values in any era. COINTELPRO remains a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between security and freedom in a democratic society. Its story reveals how easily authority, even when well-intentioned, can drift into overreach when transparency and accountability are absent. Surveillance programs, when unchecked, do not only affect policies, they leave lasting marks on lives, organizations, and public trust. As we reflect on this chapter of American history, it becomes clear that the lessons of COINTELPRO extend beyond the past. They serve as a moral guide for the present and future. Democratic principles are fragile, and the responsibility to protect civil liberties rests with institutions and citizens alike. Understanding the consequences of secrecy, manipulation, and unchecked authority ensures that society remains vigilant and that freedoms are not eroded in the name of security. The program's exposure and the subsequent reforms illustrate both the dangers of inattention and the potential for corrective action. While some harms could not be undone, the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the establishment of oversight mechanisms, and the ongoing discussion about surveillance ethics provide a framework for preventing similar abuses. Today, the shadow of COINTELPRO reminds us that freedom is not guaranteed, it must be actively safeguarded. Citizens, policymakers, and institutions alike share responsibility for ensuring that the tools of power are used ethically and transparently. Historical reflection is not merely academic, it is a form of civic engagement, a call to learn from past mistakes to shape a fairer, more just society. As we conclude this exploration, let us remember the individuals and communities affected, not as victims of a bygone era, but as witnesses to the consequences of secrecy and overreach. Their experiences serve as both testimony and warning. Liberty thrives when scrutiny exists, and democracy falters when it does not. The story of COINTELPRO is not only a tale of surveillance and secrecy, it is a testament to resilience, reflection, and the enduring need for ethical vigilance. By examining the past with care and attention, we honor the principles that define American democracy and reinforce the responsibility of each citizen to uphold them.
Thanks for watching.